We just talked about the idea of a schema and how it can help with lots of different kinds of judgments and decisions. The question now is, when do we use one schema rather than another to make judgments that could be influenced by one or both of those schemas and expectations? To take one example, what schema might we use to think about this individual person? Say you encounter this person and you don't know very much about that person. If you're going to make a schema-driven judgment, which schema would you use? You could use a schema you have about scientists to inform what this person will be like in an interaction. You may use a schema about chemists specifically to make an inference about this person. You may also rely on gender-based schemas because you see that this person is a woman, and so maybe that female schema biases your judgments. And also, this woman looks pretty intense, so maybe you have another schema for intense people generally that you use to inform your judgments and decisions. Which of these would you use? And maybe they lead to different conclusions. Potentially, your schema about a scientist and your schema about a woman may produce distinct judgments about the very same person. So which one is most likely to be impactful? Well, in general, the term accessibility encapsulates this process of which schema is the most influential. In general, we use the schema at the forefront of our minds when we use schemas to make judgments and decisions. That is, we use the most accessible schema, the one that's the most ready to be applied to a particular circumstance. Sometimes schemas are chronically accessible. So in the case before, maybe you're more likely to use your gender-based schema if you're a gender scholar and you spend lots of times thinking about gender, thinking about what it means to be male or female or the social pressures therein. For you, gender is a chronically accessible schema. But schemas can also be made more accessible by the situation. This is called priming. So when a schema becomes accessible for any number of reasons in this moment, it's the one that's most likely to be applied. Here, the very same schema, the gender-based schema, may come to mind because you just watched a hacky comedy act from the 1980s about the difference between men and women. So right now, in this very moment, you have at the forefront of your mind this general schema about men and women, and it's the schema that's your most accessible at this moment. Now, there are several methods of priming that we'll talk about. One is what's called subliminal priming, and this is what happens below the level of consciousness. It's possible for words or images to be presented so quickly that they cannot be consciously recognized, and yet they can make one schema more accessible than another. This is how we do it in the lab. It's unclear how much this exact process mimics real life, but it proves the point that you can be made aware of something. A schema can become more accessible even when you're not aware of it happening to you. You can also prime people using supraliminal means, which is at a consciously perceivable level. Now, this isn't to say that people are aware that they're being primed, but that things you're aware of in the front of your face can prime a schema without you necessarily understanding that that's what's happening. In a scientific laboratory, what we might do is use sentence unscramble tasks, which you'll see an example of later, where you might unscramble a bunch of sentences, but a lot of the words in those sentences prime one of your schemas. Or just by viewing various images or words as part of a different kind of activity, that kind of consistency in the words or images that you're being exposed to can help prime a schema as well. As an example of a supraliminal prime, consider this. If you're in a large classroom with a lot of other students, that environment might prime your role of a student. We talked about how roles can have their own schemas. In this case, you might have your student role primed in this moment, which leads you to act in certain ways, think in certain ways, and process information in certain ways. Now, you're the very same person, but you go home and you're in your dorm room. I can't imagine anyone's dorm room looks like this, but this is a photo that I have available to me. Here's a photo of a dorm room, Being at home might prime a very different role, and that is the role of a roommate. So here, you're no longer in the student mindset because your environment has changed, and it primes different schemas and associations you have with this role that can change your behavior, thoughts, feelings, and so forth. Here's another example of priming, and just kind of go with this for the moment. Just do this activity with me, and we'll see where it takes us. I'm going to ask you to unscramble the following words. What would these letters unscramble to create? Fork, very nice job. What would these unscramble to? Cup, pretty easy. This one, knife. This one, spoon, very good. This one, plate, not bad. Now, hopefully that was pretty easy to you. You were able to unscramble all of these different words to create these other kinds of outcomes. But if those first four words were different, your answer to the fifth question might have been different also. If these were what you saw, you might have unscrambled the fifth word as pedal, because you were primed to think of a different schema. On the left, you see all of these words prime your general schema of cutlery and kitchen utensils, which makes the first answer to question number 5 seem like plate, because you're ready to think in those terms. You're ready to unscramble the word to make that kind of word compared to any other. And indeed, the first 4 can only be unscrambled in the way that you see here, but the fifth one could be unscrambled either way. So if you had been primed with a different schema, you very well would have just as quickly unscrambled word number 5 to make pedal, because your flour schema would have been more accessible.